The first night I slept in that house, I took the batteries out of the hallway clock because I couldn't stand hearing it. Every other clock in the farmhouse was dead in its own way. The microwave was blank. The one over the stove was stopped at 10 after 6. My mother's little ceramic kitchen clock, the one shaped like a rooster for reasons nobody ever explained, was sitting at 4:49 and had probably been there for years. But that hallway one upstairs kept going. Just a thin little tick, uneven, like it was catching on something every few seconds. So I stood there in my socks, in this narrow upstairs hall with peeling wallpaper and one bare bulb, and I popped the back off and took both batteries out. I remember because one of them had leaked a little and got that chalky white stuff on my thumb. I set them on the windowsill, went downstairs, rinsed my hand in the kitchen sink, came back up maybe 10 minutes later. It was ticking again. And it wasn't just running. It was back on 2:17 in the morning exactly, like I'd never touched it. I came back to the farmhouse because my mother died and somebody had to deal with what was left. That's the unromantic version. There wasn't really a debate about it. Most of my relatives live close enough to have opinions but not close enough to lift furniture, and I was the one who had no good excuse. I'd left home in my 20s and stayed gone. I didn't come back for holidays much. Didn't call enough. Didn't ask questions I probably should have asked. Then my mother died, and suddenly I was driving down a gravel road outside Decorah with the back of my car full of empty boxes and contractor bags, like if I organized it well enough I could do the whole thing cleanly. The place sits out in Winneshiek County with soybean fields on both sides and nothing occupied near it for at least a mile. When I say alone, I mean actually alone, not suburban alone, not cabin weekend alone. I mean if you stand on the porch at dusk, you can see the road, the fields, the tree line, and no proof that anybody else is living a life nearby. I was always fine with that, honestly. I like being by myself. I sleep better without people in the next room. My job now is mostly remote, and I am the kind of person who'll eat soup over the sink and call that dinner. Solitude isn't the scary part for me. The house itself smelled exactly the way I remembered and not at all the way I wanted. Dust, old coffee tins, damp wood pushing up from the unfinished basement. The basement had that cold mineral smell like wet concrete and rust, and the whole house carried a little of it, even upstairs. When the wind hit the loose siding on the west wall, it rattled unevenly, not a steady noise, more like somebody tapping their fingers with no rhythm. The first couple days were boring in the useful way. I sorted tax records. I hauled an end table with one short leg out to the garage. I made 3 donation piles and 1 trash pile. Then had to redo them because grief turns your brain into wet cardboard and suddenly you're standing there holding a lamp and forgetting why. I wore my old green work gloves with the torn fingertip on the right index finger. I drank bad grocery store coffee out of my mother's sunflower mug because all the travel mugs in the house smelled like stale milk. I found a kitchen drawer full of rubber bands, expired coupons, and the unopened birthday cards my younger sister Lenora used to send me after I left. I need to be careful with how I say that because it sounds sweeter than it was. I kept them. I still keep them, actually. Back then they were in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus and spare keys, and I would see them every time I went looking for tape or scissors. I never opened most of them. Throwing them away felt cruel. Opening them felt worse. So there they sat, year after year, as if not deciding was somehow kinder than either choice. That's probably enough information for you to form an opinion about me, and you're not wrong. The other thing I started noticing almost right away was the family photos. My mother had them everywhere. Mantel, hallway, buffet, side tables, all the usual little silver and wood frames that people collect over decades. There were pictures of me in a choir dress I hated, me at 16 with a perm that should have been illegal, me in front of my first apartment, my mother with cousins, my mother with church friends, my mother with Uncle Harlan out by the grain bins. What kept landing wrong was that once I really started looking, Lenora was barely in any of them. I don't mean there were fewer because she was younger. I mean whole stretches of years where, if you believed the walls of that house, I was an only child. At first I figured my mother had taken them down after Lenora disappeared, same as people pack away hospital things after somebody dies. That made emotional sense even if I didn't like it. Lenora was the family wound nobody touched directly. The story, the one told to outsiders and eventually to ourselves, was that she wandered off in 2008 and nobody heard from her again. She'd been troubled, unstable, hard to pin down. Those were the words people used. I hadn't lived at home by then. I'd left before that. I let that fact do too much work for me for too long. By the third evening I had a system. Boxes by room, a yellow legal pad with what needed to be kept for probate. A little portable radio in the kitchen for company, though half the time all it brought in was static and farm reports. I slept downstairs because the upstairs mattresses smelled old and sweet in a way I didn't trust. The couch was lumpy but usable. I kept a flashlight on the coffee table and my car keys in the same bowl every night. And then there was that clock. I told myself it had to be residual charge, or corroded contacts, or some old wiring in the wall feeding it just enough to keep the mechanism twitching. It wasn't plugged in, but old houses do weird things. If you know old farmhouses, you're probably already laughing at me a little, because they all have one thing that makes no practical sense and you either fix it or start living around it. I tried the living around it approach first, but every time I removed the batteries it stopped for a while and then reset itself to 2:17 in the morning. Not 2:16, not 2:18. 2:17. A day or so after that, I was in the kitchen going through recipe books because my mother had apparently preserved every church potluck casserole on paper since the late 70s. Between a page for rhubarb bars and one for hamburger hash, I found a grocery receipt folded into quarters. Nothing dramatic. Bread, canned soup, coffee, cat litter, ibuprofen. What made me stop was the date. It was months after Lenora supposedly disappeared. I sat down at the kitchen table with that receipt and another one I found in a different recipe book maybe 10 minutes later. Same thing. Different store, same general period, all dated after the year everybody said Lenora was gone. I remember tracing the printed date with my thumb like maybe I was misreading it. The paper was soft at the fold like it had been handled more than once. My first thought was easy. My mother had kept old papers everywhere. Maybe the dates meant nothing. Maybe she used the backs for notes and tucked them wherever. But both receipts had items circled in blue pen. Both were folded the same way. And both were in recipe books Lenora used to use when she was still around enough to cook. I said her name out loud without thinking. Just Lenora? The hallway clock upstairs stopped. I stood there with one hand on the edge of the table. I could hear the radio. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear the wind tapping the siding. But the clock stopped so completely that I noticed the absence of it before I understood what I was listening for. Then, maybe 15 seconds later, it started again. That was the first time I had to actually stop and think, no, wait. I called my Uncle Harlan the next day because if anybody knew where the family's stories came from, it was him. He and my mother had spent 20 years curating the version of events people were allowed to have. He came by in his work coat that always smelled faintly like gasoline and wintergreen, even in warm weather, and walked the place like he still owned pieces of it in his head. He is one of those men who can make concern sound like criticism without changing his volume. I asked him about the receipts. He barely looked at them. He said my mother never accepted what happened to Lenora. Said she kept things. Made little shrines out of paper. Said I shouldn't go rooting through old boxes if I wanted to get this done before the estate sale. I asked what exactly happened back then. Not the family summary, the real version. He said there wasn't another version. I asked whether police were ever involved. That was the first time he really looked at me. His whole face changed, not in a dramatic way, just tightened down. His jaw set. He took the receipts from me, put them back on the table like they were dirty, and said the sheriff had enough to do without chasing girls who wanted to be gone. Then he asked why I was suddenly so interested now after all these years. That stung because it was meant to. And here is the part I can't really clean up for myself. He was asking something ugly but not untrue. When I was young, leaving mattered more to me than understanding anything. I knew there was something wrong in that house. Not one big movie scene, just wrong in little household ways. Doors locked at odd times. My mother changing the subject too fast. Lenora going quiet whenever Harlan came over. I saw enough to know there was a shape there. I did what I thought survival looked like, which was get out and don't look back. At the time, that felt brave. Looking back, it also felt convenient. That same night, the landline rang once at exactly 2:17 in the morning. I need to explain that there was no reason for the landline to even be connected except my mother never canceled anything. She paid for the same newspaper twice for a while because one was autodraft and one was by mail. So when it rang, one sharp old-fashioned ring from the kitchen, it cut through the whole house. I was awake before my mind caught up. My feet hit the floor cold. I went down in the dark, one hand on the wall, and picked it up before it could ring again. Nobody said anything. Not breathing. Not static. Not a wrong number pause. Just a line so quiet it felt occupied. I said hello twice. Then I said Lenora's name, which I don't know why I did. Maybe because by then everything had started leaning in her direction whether I wanted it to or not. Upstairs, the clock stopped ticking again. I hung up and stood there long enough for my hand to go numb around the receiver. Then I put it down very carefully and went back to the couch without turning on any lights. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I went upstairs and finally dealt with the attic room. When I was a kid, there was one room off the back hall under the eaves that I was not allowed to enter. Everybody has one family rule that's too firm for the thing it's about, and that was ours. It wasn't storage exactly. It wasn't a bedroom anybody used. The explanation changed depending on who you asked. Unsafe floorboards. Junk, mold, mice, pick one. By the time I was there cleaning the house out, the door had been nailed shut from the outside with 2 old finish nails through the trim and 1 longer nail crooked near the latch. That alone told me enough. I got a pry bar from the garage and worked it loose slow because old wood splits if you look at it wrong. The whole hallway smelled like attic dust by the time it opened. Inside, the room was smaller than I remembered, with 1 narrow bed, a dresser, and sloped walls painted a faded blue. The curtains were pinned shut. There was a water stain in 1 corner. Nothing monstrous, just a room kept from view for too long. Then I opened the dresser. The top drawer was full of letters, bundled loose, stacked sideways, stuffed under old scarves, hundreds of them, all addressed to Lenora but not under 1 name. 3 surnames, Lenora Kessler on some, Lenora Veith on others, which made my stomach drop because that was Harlan's name. And then a 3rd surname I didn't know at all. Several envelopes had return addresses from psychiatric treatment centers in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Some were opened, some not. A few had notes in my mother's handwriting on the back. Dates, underlines, 1 just marked no. By then my hands had started doing that useless thing where your fingers don't feel attached correctly. I sat on the floor because I didn't trust my knees. There were no police reports, no missing person flyers, no official papers, just letters and family management. All at once it stopped looking like a disappearance and started looking like a story built on purpose. In the bottom drawer, shoved under a pile of pillowcases, was a cassette recorder and 1 tape already inside it. The recorder still had batteries. I don't know why that bothers me, but it does. Like somebody expected it to be used again. I brought it to the bed and hit play. At first it was just the soft mechanical hiss of old tape and my mother's voice, smaller than I remembered. She sounded tired, not theatrical, not confessional in some grand way, more like somebody forcing herself to do 1 errand before she lost her nerve. She said if Marin finds this, then I was right not to trust paper left in plain sight. She said Lenora left willingly. She said Lenora had said things about a family member, accusations, and my mother didn't know what was true at first. Only that once said out loud, those things could not be unsaid. She said Harlan told everybody Lenora was unstable, and then everybody kept repeating it because it was easier than splitting the family open. I was holding the recorder so hard the plastic edge was digging into my palm. Then my mother said, very clearly, we told people she wandered off because nobody wanted the sheriff asking questions about your uncle. I remember the room going strangely small around that sentence. Not spinning, not some dramatic collapse, just small. Like there wasn't enough air for the amount of fact now. And then, from the hallway behind me, a man's voice said my name, Marin. Flat. Familiar. I hit stop so hard I almost dropped the recorder. There was a soft scrape from outside the room like a boot turning on old wood. I didn't say anything. My mouth had gone dry in 1 second. I could hear my own breathing getting shallow and fast, and somewhere downstairs the loose siding clicked in the wind. Then the hallway clock started ticking again. That is the part that still gets me, weirdly. Not because of the clock itself, just because it meant somebody was out there in the hall, in that house at that hour, while I was sitting in the room nobody was supposed to enter, holding a tape that named him. I didn't go look. I didn't call out. I slid the recorder and as many letters as I could grab into a laundry basket that was sitting by the bed, took pictures of the dresser drawers, the envelopes, the room, the tape label, everything, hands shaking so badly half of them blurred. Then I stood there listening. No footsteps. No voice. Just the house settling and that stupid clock marking time like nothing in the world had changed. I moved fast after that. Faster than I would have thought I could in a house full of dead things and memories. I got the basket, my phone, the receipts, my keys. I left the donation pile, the legal pad, my coat. I walked out the back door first because it gave me a view of the drive. Harlan's truck wasn't there. That didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. I loaded everything into my car and left before sunrise without turning on the porch light. I did not tell any relative what I found. A week later, I got a call from a county investigator saying there had been an electrical fire at the farmhouse, contained mostly to the upstairs back section. Accidental, they said. Old wiring. The attic room took the worst of it. I thanked him and hung up and sat on my kitchen floor for a while with my phone in my lap. I had already copied every photo and every letter by then. I have them now in 3 separate places, digital copies of all of it, because once that fire happened, I stopped believing in coincidence entirely. I don't answer unknown numbers anymore. I don't do Thanksgiving. I don't do Christmas with anybody who shares my blood. When people ask why I'm not close with family, I say it's complicated, which is one of those phrases that usually means the truth is too ugly to fit in casual conversation. I know some people would say I should have gone straight to the police with everything. Maybe they're right. Maybe I still will. Some of the letters were old. Some were newer. Enough of them pointed to real places that I started making calls quietly, carefully, under other pretenses. A few treatment centers wouldn't confirm anything. One had closed. One transferred me 3 times and then disconnected. The third surname led nowhere clean. Lenora may have lived under all of them. Or one of them. Or none. And that is the part I am still stuck on, even more than the tape, even more than hearing my name outside that room. A few days after the fire, when I was going through one last box I'd brought back with sewing things and old linens, I found recent utility bills hidden in my mother's sewing cabinet. Not old ones. Recent. Addressed to Lenora Kessler under that third surname at an address I didn't recognize. They were dated only weeks before my mother's funeral. Story 2. The next one comes from somebody who stayed in a place he already knew he should have left. I took that security job because the number looked fake. That's really the cleanest way to say it. The pay was too high for standing around in work boots outside a labor camp and keeping drunk guys from cutting catalytic converters off company trucks. If a thing looks too good, usually it is, and not in the fun way. I knew that going in. I still drove up there. This was outside Happy Camp, up in Siskiyou County. After a bad wildfire season when every other posting was recovery work, debris removal, dead timber, hazard clearing. Burn scar country. If you've never been in it, it's hard to explain the particular ugliness. The ground looks skinned. The trees are still standing in places but black and stripped, like they stayed upright out of habit. Everything smells like ash and diesel all at once. Even your clean shirts start carrying it after a day. At night, the generators hum behind the trailers, and farther out you hear chainsaws from crews working late or too early, and after a while you stop reacting to either. The camp was temporary in the way everything permanent likes to pretend it isn't. Double-wide trailers lined along logging roads, portable light towers, chain-link sections wired together, medical tents with enough supplies to handle a small disaster. That last part mattered later. At the time, I registered it the way I registered everything else, as somebody else's budget. I still had my expired EMP certification card in my wallet. I carry it for reasons I don't love. It's been dead for years, but I kept it because I liked the version of me it suggested. Somebody who had once helped people on purpose. By then I'd burned through savings, picked up ugly debt, and gotten used to telling myself every bad month was a temporary one. The security contract was supposed to patch the gap. Couple months, maybe more. Sleep in a bunk, keep watch, don't get curious. That last instruction wasn't written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. Most of the workers clearing timber were undocumented day laborers brought in fast, men rotating through every few days, sometimes families along the edges doing cleanup work nobody admitted to officially. Supervisors introduced people by first name only, if that. Sometimes not even that. A guy would be there 3 nights, then gone, and by the end of the week nobody could tell you his last name, where he'd come from, or whether he'd actually been paid. That felt wrong immediately, but wrong in a labor camp way, not in the larger way it turned out to be. The whole setup ran on plausible deniability. Nobody knew enough about anybody else to be useful later. The mundane parts were almost comical. Powdered eggs at 6, white plastic coffee stirrers softening in paper cups, a shared microwave in the guard trailer that smelled permanently like burnt noodles. My bunk had a sag in the middle, so I folded my spare sweatshirt under the mattress for lumbar support like a middle-aged man trapped in a younger man's bad decisions. I kept a roll of antacids in my pocket because camp food and stress had formed a working relationship. Real glamorous stuff. The first thing that stuck with me was the injuries. We had a medical tent fully stocked. I mean actually stocked. Suture kits, oxygen, splints, IV bags, enough boxes with neat labels to make any rural clinic jealous. But when workers got hurt, and they did, because wildfire cleanup is basically hazard stacked on hazard, they weren't treated there unless it was something small enough to hide. Bad cuts, sprains, heat issues, smoke problems, crush injuries that needed more than a bandage. Those guys got driven away at night. Not in ambulances, in pickup trucks or vans. I told myself the company wanted to avoid insurance reports. That was shady, but not rare. Plenty of outfits would rather ghost a medical paper trail than pay. I clocked it, disliked it, and kept cashing checks. That's the part I own. A supervisor named Laurel Mott handled most of the camp logistics. Calm voice, clean clipboard, that kind of person. She had a way of making ugly instructions sound administratively reasonable. Another supervisor, Denny, was all bark and nicotine. Laurel was the one to watch. Denny wanted to scare people. Laurel wanted them to cooperate. A week or so in, one of the workers, Tomas Arreola, got into it with management over withheld wages. Not shouting for the cameras, real anger, controlled, worse, honestly. He'd been promised one rate, got handed another, and started demanding names, numbers, who to call, which agency. All the words supervisors hate hearing from somebody they assume won't press them. I was near enough to hear pieces of it. Laurel kept saying payroll discrepancy like those 2 words were a tarp you could throw over anything. Tomas was gone by the next morning. They said he quit and hitchhiked south. That would have been thin but usable if not for one thing. His backpack was still shoved under his bunk. I only saw it because I was doing a half-serious walkthrough after lights out, and one of the other guys asked if he could move into Tomas's spot since it was near a fan. I looked under there and found the bag still zipped, his cash tucked in an inside pocket with a pair of socks and a small plastic rosary. Not a fortune, but enough that nobody walking out angry leaves it behind by choice. I should have said something then. Instead, I stood there with that bag in my hands and started making excuses on his behalf. Maybe he got spooked and planned to come back. Maybe somebody else packed in a hurry. Maybe I didn't know how people leave when they're out of options. All that generous reasoning people do when the alternative would require action from them. And I was already compromised by then. That's important. I had been padding overtime reports. Nothing movie big. 30 minutes here, 45 there, a couple overnight checks I rounded up because the company was robbing everybody, and I told myself stealing from thieves made me Robin Hood with acid reflux. Laurel knew. I didn't know she knew yet, but that kind of rot never stays one direction. After Tomas disappeared, the camp mood changed in a way that was hard to point at cleanly. Men stopped hanging around the common tables after dinner. Conversations dropped when supervisors walked past. A couple workers began sleeping in their boots, which if you've done labor camp living you know means they expected to have to move fast. Tomas's wages, what he'd been paid in cash that week, stayed in his bunk untouched for days because nobody wanted to be seen taking money from a vanished man. I passed that spot 3, maybe 4 nights in a row. Same rolled bills, same little knot in my stomach. Then came the first release. County inspectors showed up out of nowhere after an anonymous complaint. 2 trucks, clipboards, high-visibility vests, the works. Management snapped into best behavior so fast it would have been funny if I hadn't already been looking at it differently. Cleaned common areas. Opened the med tent wide. Announced overdue wages would be settled immediately. Suddenly bottled water appeared in stacks like hydration had just been invented. Laurel smiled more in one afternoon than I'd seen all month. And for a minute, I bought it. I really did. That's the part that embarrasses me almost more than the money. I saw a little external pressure and immediately wanted the story to become boring again. Wanted compliance to mean correction. Wanted the world to be one stern visit away from decent. There was one detail I couldn't settle, though. Whenever the inspectors approached certain trailers, not all of them, just certain ones along the north edge, the generators would briefly cut out. The whole camp would dip into this weird held-breath silence. Hum gone, lights blipping off, chainsaws in the distance suddenly louder because there was nothing under them. Then the power would kick back on by the time the inspectors reached the next section. Maybe that was electrical load. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe a dozen maybes. But it happened more than once. I remember standing there with my clipboard, hearing the generator die and the camp go hollow, and thinking, what are they trying to keep dark right now? After the inspectors left, management kept the good behavior going for about 3 days. Wages got squared publicly. Meals improved a notch. Safety briefings suddenly existed. A few guys even laughed again. I told myself maybe whoever filed the complaint had done enough. Maybe fear of exposure had corrected whatever cheap contractor scam this was. Then it got worse than before. Workers started getting called one by one into the payroll trailer late at night. No posted list, no pattern that made sense, just a supervisor appearing at a bunk door and saying payroll needs you. After that, the men came back different, if they came back at all. Shoulders up, eyes down, less eye contact. They'd stop talking when guards passed, which, fair, but this was different, not resentment, calculation, like they were trying to decide whether you were stupid or dangerous. I watched one guy come out of that trailer and walk straight into the wash station without turning the light on. He stood there at a dry sink for a full minute doing nothing. At some point you stop asking whether a thing is happening and start asking what shape it is. I started hearing phrases, transfer loads, North Run, documentation cleanup. The kind of language people use when they want logistics to smother morality. One night I was doing rounds past the storage containers and heard Laurel and Denny near the back step of the trailer. Voices low. Laurel said, "If Oregon confirms intake by morning, shift the rest on the next load." Denny asked what to do about the guard logs. Laurel said, "I already handled the guard logs." That was the first moment my stomach actually dropped, because I knew exactly which guard logs she meant. I confronted her the next afternoon, if you can call it that. It was more me trying to sound like I wasn't rattled while she filed papers like I was an inconvenience. I asked what intake meant, asked what transfer loads were, asked where Tomas had really gone. Laurel didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten me outright. She just looked up and said if I wanted to discuss irregularities, we should start with the overtime sheets bearing my signature. Then she named the exact dates I'd falsified. You ever have somebody touch the back of your neck without touching you? That. She said the company had been generous in overlooking minor dishonesty given the difficulty staffing remote contracts. She said if investigators ever reviewed payroll, my own submissions would make me legally vulnerable. Then she asked whether I wanted to be helpful or dramatic. That is the point where a better person probably makes a better choice faster. Instead, I kept taking the money for a couple more days because I told myself the workers still needed guards more than they needed another unemployed bystander. That's the lie I used. There was a grain of truth inside it, which made it useful. If I stayed, maybe I could see more. Maybe stop something. Also, and more honestly, I was afraid of getting buried alongside them when the numbers got examined. Self-preservation and conscience were both talking at once, and self-preservation had a much clearer voice. Still, something had shifted. I started recording what I could. Laurel by the payroll trailer. Denny complaining about bodies and paperwork like both were inventory issues. Vehicle plates. Timestamps. Photos of bunk assignments that changed too fast. I kept copies off camp Wi-Fi because even I wasn't dumb enough for that. I slept worse. Ate standing up. Started checking vans before they left the equipment lot under the excuse of routine security. Then came the last spiral down. A white transport van backed up behind the payroll trailer a little before midnight. No company logo. Rear windows painted over. I saw 2 workers led out separately. Then a third already inside when the back doors shut. No boots on any of them. That was what hit first. No boots in a camp built on gravel, slash, nails and splinters. You don't move people barefoot unless you don't want them moving themselves. I stepped in front of the van. Not heroically. More like my legs did it while the rest of me was still arguing. Denny came out cussing, Laurel right behind him, all calm edges and bad intent. She told me to move, said transfer paperwork was above my clearance. I asked to see the paperwork. She smiled like I'd made a cute point. I had my phone recording in my pocket. My mouth tasted like copper. The generators were humming behind us, chainsaws far off, somebody in another trailer laughing at something unrelated. It was one of those moments that feels offensively normal around the edges. Then the van lurched forward half a foot. That made it public. I started shouting. Not smart, not tactical, just loud. Told them to open it. Told the workers to make noise if they were in there. Denny grabbed my arm. I shoved him off. Laurel hissed my name and said I was ruining my life over people who'd be gone by morning anyway, which is an ugly sentence to hear in any context. I got the backlatch before either of them could stop me. Inside were 3 workers packed against the metal interior without phones, without IDs, without boots. One had a split lip. One had his wrists zip-tied in front. All 3 looked at me with that same blank, overused fear I had been pretending not to recognize for weeks. The first thing one of them said was, "Which state are they taking us to this time?" That word, time, was the whole floor dropping out. Before I could answer, one of the men shouldered past me and jumped. Barefoot onto gravel, then running anyway, stumbling toward the highway access road like every rock under him was better than staying in that van. Denny went after him. I tackled Denny badly. More falling than tackling, but enough to slow him. The other 2 started shouting. Somebody else came out of the trailers. Then more somebodies. Once a scene gets witnesses, the math changes. And that was all it needed. A worker I didn't know started filming. Another guard who'd been staying strategically blind for weeks suddenly found a conscience once it was crowded. Laurel kept saying this was a labor transfer, a voluntary relocation, paperwork issue, as if repetition could rebuild the lie. The guy who'd run made it toward the road and nearly got clipped by a pickup, which finally got an outside driver calling it in. Police came, county first, then state people, then more people with notepads and questions management did not want. Several supervisors vanished before the arrests started. Laurel made bail and disappeared. Denny, last I heard, cut some deal. I spent months in interviews explaining why my logs were falsified, why I stayed after I suspected things, why I needed a worker in a bootless van to finally decide what side I was on. None of my answers sounded good, because they weren't. I paid fines, lost the contract, burned what was left of my reputation in that line of work. Fair enough. I still keep that expired EMP card in my wallet. Not because it excuses anything. It doesn't. I keep it because opening that van was the first decent thing I'd done in years, and I need a reminder of how low the bar had gotten before I stepped over it. What I never learned, what I still don't know when summer comes around and the fire maps start filling in again, is whether that camp was one bad contractor freelancing misery in the woods, or just one stop in a bigger route moving the same men from one burned scar to the next. Story 3. The last story in this video is the one that still doesn't feel finished to me. I was under the bed trying not to breathe loud enough for them to hear me. That's how this starts, unfortunately. Not in the car, not at the first motel, not with some wise young woman making a dramatic choice, flat on motel carpet that smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, cheek pressed against a lost bobby pin and something sticky I did not inspect. while somebody outside my room tested the deadbolt very gently, like they already had reason to think I might open it if they were polite. Then a man's voice, right outside the door, quiet enough that I almost thought I imagined it. "She's still in there." I put my hand over my mouth so hard my lips hurt. My phone was in my bra because I'd started sleeping with it there. That's a ridiculous sentence, but there you go. I could see the strip of light under the door. I could see shadows move across it once, then stop. The truck engines from the lot were vibrating through the wall so constantly that every other sound had to fight through them. I remember thinking, with total sincerity, this is so stupid. Not the danger. Me. The whole chain of choices that got me under that bed in a roadside motel near Laguna Pueblo because I had been too proud to make one humiliating phone call. 4 days earlier, I quit school and drove west. Impulsively is the word I'd use if I wanted to sound fun. Really, I panicked and reframed it as freedom. I left college in the middle of a bad stretch, bad grades, bad sleep, bad everything, and told only my roommate I needed to get out for a bit. I did not tell my parents because I didn't want to hear myself sound young and reckless while they sounded correct. I packed a duffel, my notebook, 3 t-shirts I actually liked, and the hoodie with paint on the sleeve from helping a friend move. I also packed the little spiral notebook where I keep handwritten lists of every motel I've stayed in since leaving home for school. I know that's weird. I don't even have a cool reason. I'm just scared of forgetting where I've been. Names blur. Towns blur. Days especially blur when you're driving. So I write them down. Motel name, town, room number if I remember something small about the place. Waffle machine broken, weird shower pressure, blue floral bedspread. It makes me feel less like I'm evaporating. The first day felt amazing, of course it did. Windows down, gas station coffee that tasted burnt in a good way. That fake feeling of becoming a different person because you've crossed a state line. I drove through Texas, then farther, sleeping wherever was cheap and had a front desk light on late. The bulletin boards at some of those roadside stops were the first thing that started to bother me. Missing person flyers everywhere. That's sad but not rare. What got me was how several were layered right over older missing person flyers without the old ones being removed first. Just a new face stapled over another face. Corners curling so you could still see names underneath. I told myself not to become the kind of traveler who makes symbolism out of corkboards. Also, in this matters, I kept posting little live updates. Nothing with exact addresses, I thought. Just photos. Coffee cup, highway sign, motel lamp, stupid things. Still heading west. Needed this. That kind of vague, dramatic nonsense people post when they want to be perceived without actually talking to anyone. The green SUV showed up the second day. Dark green, older model, dusty, with one roof rack bar and no sticker on the back window. That's what I remember. I saw it outside a motel in Amarillo, then later at a truck stop farther along, then again the next morning in a different lot. I never saw the driver clearly. Once I saw a shape behind the wheel and once somebody in a cap getting out, but nothing I'd swear to. I figured it was road construction forcing everybody onto the same route. There were detours everywhere. If you're driving west long enough, you start seeing the same semis too. That's normal. Or normal enough to talk yourself into. By the time I hit New Mexico, the air had that dry, metallic smell you get after rain hits hot pavement and disappears. The desert does this thing where it looks empty and busy at the same time. Huge sky, not much around, but every gas station is its own tiny planet of people making decisions at 2 in the morning. Outside Gallup, I stopped for snacks and one of those neon sports drinks that tastes like melted popsicle. The cashier looked at me, then glanced past me out the window and said, "Your dad find you yet?" I just stared at her. I said, "Sorry?" She shrugged immediately like she'd already said too much. "Thought you were with that guy asking." I hadn't mentioned family. Hadn't mentioned I was traveling alone. Hadn't said anything except hi. When I turned, the green SUV was parked across the lot by the air pump. I did what people do when a thing arrives too early to justify the amount of fear it produces. I smoothed it down. Maybe she mixed me up with somebody else. Maybe some other girl my age in a hoodie had a frantic father looking for her. Maybe the SUV wasn't related. Maybe I was becoming insufferable to myself. I left faster than I meant to, though, and after that I started noticing how often I could be noticed. A guy at a diner in Grants called me by my first name while topping off my coffee. He was not my server. He wasn't wearing a name tag. He walked past my booth, smiled too casually, and said, "Need anything else, Celia?" I hadn't used my card there yet. Nobody had said my name near me. I had ordered by pointing at the menu because my throat felt weird for some reason. I said no thanks like a person trying to stay inside a normal day. Then I went to the bathroom and sat on the closed toilet for a minute staring at the floor tiles. From then on, my trust in basic interactions got thin fast. Every front desk felt too warm. Every person glancing at my license felt like it lasted half a beat too long. I started sleeping in different clothes than the ones I wore into motels because I got it into my head that being recognized by outfit was part of it. So I'd check in wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, then sleep in gray sweats and a college hoodie and tell myself that counted as strategy. At one motel, the ice machine was outside my room. Late at night, every time I passed it, the hum cut out. Not permanently, just as I got near it. Then it would start again once I was past. I know appliances cycle. I know that, but by then every little pause in the world felt like it was making room for something. If you're listening and thinking, why didn't you call somebody? That's fair. I kept almost calling my parents. My thumb hovered over my mom's name more than once. But admitting I had panicked, quit school, run off, and maybe gotten myself followed felt more humiliating than staying vulnerable for one more night. That's the ugliest true thing in this story. I would rather have remained exposed than sound foolish out loud. So I kept going. Near Laguna Pueblo, I pulled into a roadside motel because I was too tired to make a smarter choice. Thin walls, 2 floors. Parking lot lit the color of old butter. Trucks idling all around. The clerk was a woman about my mother's age who seemed more bored than dangerous, which actually relaxed me for maybe 10 seconds. Then she handed me paperwork already filled out. My full name, my license plate number. Home address half right, like copied from something once and remembered wrong later. I told her this wasn't mine. She blinked, took it back, and looked genuinely confused, not caught, confused. She said my coworker must have started it. There was nobody else on shift. I could see the whole office. 1 chair, 1 desk fan, a coffee maker, a dead plant, her. She turned around like she also expected somebody to be there and then realized there wasn't. I almost left then. I should have. Instead, I took a different room on the second floor because she offered it and because I was exhausted and because bad choices stack best when each one feels only slightly worse than the last. I texted my roommate the motel name, which was the first smart thing I'd done all day. I did not text my family. Of course I didn't. I pushed the dresser against the door after I got in. Not because I was convinced, because I was becoming convinced and wanted to pretend it was still a joke. I showered fast, left the bathroom light on, and sat on the bed in my socks watching the curtains move a little from the air conditioner. Truck engines vibrated through the wall. The air smelled faintly of bleach and that hot dust smell motels all share. Then headlights swept across the curtains. Slowly. Not a car pulling through. A deliberate pass. Bright, pause, dim, bright again. I got up and looked through the edge of the curtain with one finger. Dark green SUV rolling by at walking speed. My hand stopped working right after that. I dropped my phone twice trying to unlock it. I finally got the highway patrol number up because I didn't know what else to do, and then I froze because calling still meant explaining everything from the beginning, and I hated that idea with a kind of stupid intensity. While I was standing there deciding whether to be embarrassed or safe, voices moved into the walkway outside my room. One of them said, very low, "She's traveling alone to clear her head." That was the phrase I had used earlier that day in a town 40 miles back when a woman at a laundromat asked where I was headed. I had smiled and said, "Nowhere really. Just driving alone to clear my head." I never posted that. Never texted it. Never said it on the phone. The other voice asked, "Did she call anyone yet?" That was when I shoved the phone into my bra, killed the lamp, and got under the bed. The deadbolt clicked once as they tested it, then a softer scrape like a card or tool near the latch. Not frantic, patient, which was somehow worse. I could see the lower part of the door from where I was, the slice of parking lot light underneath, shadows crossing now and then. My whole chest felt tight and shallow. I was trying to breathe through my nose, and even that sounded too loud to me. My phone was in my hand by then. I texted my roommate first. Not because that made sense, just because her thread was open. Then I called highway patrol and whispered the motel name and room number so quietly the dispatcher made me repeat it. She kept asking if I could leave the room. I said I didn't know if they were right outside. She asked how many voices. I said 2, maybe more. And then something knocked lightly against the door like whoever was out there wanted to remind me they still knew where I was. The minutes until anybody arrived did not feel like minutes. I don't have a dramatic way to say it. They felt chopped up and wrong. Door sound. Silence. Truck engine. One voice. Silence. My own pulse in my ears. At some point, somebody outside laughed once, low, like a private joke. Then another guest in the lot started yelling. I never saw that part clearly. But from the sound of it, somebody in another room must have noticed the SUV circling or the men by my door and decided to make it everybody's problem. God bless people like that, honestly. Sudden shouting. A car horn. Doors opening. The walkway noise changed all at once from controlled to messy. By the time the patrol officers got there, the green SUV was gone. I stayed under the bed until an officer knocked and identified himself 3 separate times and then slid a card with his badge under the gap. That was how far gone I was. I needed paperwork from the floor before I could crawl out. They searched the lot, took statements, talked to the clerk, who looked pale in a way I don't think she was faking. One officer asked why the registration form might have been pre-filled. She kept saying she didn't know. Another asked whether I had posted my location online. I said yes, but not exact locations, and he gave me the kind of look that means exact enough. They escorted me to Albuquerque before sunrise. I rode in my own car with a patrol unit behind me the whole way, and every pair of headlights in the mirror made my stomach knot anyway. When we stopped for gas, one of the officers told me, gently but not softly, to contact family immediately. I nodded like I hadn't spent 4 days building my own little disaster specifically to avoid that. I moved back home for a while after that, temporarily, which became longer than I expected. I stopped posting live updates online. I stopped giving strangers casual information because it turns out casual information is still information. I still keep the motel list in the notebook. I just added a new column. Unfamiliar vehicles, color, make if I know it, where I saw them. I told myself that would make me feel organized again. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just makes the page look crowded. 3 months after the motel, I got something in the mail. No return address I recognized. Inside was a motel receipt from Amarillo dated 2 days after the incident in New Mexico. Same chain, different location. Room paid in cash. Signed under my name. The handwriting looked almost exactly like mine. The part I still stare at is the D in Dunmore, because whoever signed that Amarillo receipt made it the same crooked way I do.